Barclay Damon live broadcast where we discuss all things L&E, labor, and employment. I'm Ari. Let's dig in. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Today, we are going to be telling you everything you need to know about COVID-19 sick leave laws in New York. This podcast is the first episode in a series of podcasts where we discuss a myriad of issues related to the pandemic and how basically to manage your employees and workforce. I am thrilled to announce our first guest on the podcast is Barclay Damon's practice group leader, Rosemary Enright. Hi, Rosemary.
Hey, Ari, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you so much for joining us. For our listenership, Rosemary is, as I mentioned, our practice group leader at Barclay Damon of the Labor and Employment Practice Group, which means she basically heads the group. Ro, thanks again for joining today. One thing we're going to do every episode is ask the guest a little bit, get a little personal and ask them to give us a fun or interesting fact about themselves, whether it's, your professional or your personal life. So I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I do. Please, what do you think? For those of us listening, I'll tell you, I know Rosemary from working with her has a very interesting life.
All right. Well, so I think I'll do something personal, Ari.
Okay.
And so I guess what I'll share in this episode is that at the time, I was in Zimbabwe. So it was actually on a bridge between Zimbabwe and Zambia. And at that time, that was the highest bungee jump in the world. So you would jump off the bridge there or over the Zambezi River. So I'll say that, I bungee jumped. It was 355 feet. It's called No Man's Land over the Zambezi River and lived to tell the tale.
I have to say that really surpassed my expectations for what I thought would be a fun or interesting fact. That is way more interesting than I would have anticipated even for you, Rosemary. So thanks for sharing.
Of course.
But let's dig right into it. For those of us listening, today we're talking about the New York COVID-19 paid sick leave law. Just a little bit of background. This law was signed into legislation in March 2020. The legislature passed the bill, and then Governor Cuomo subsequently signed the bill into law. And here today we're going to talk about, all the eligibility requirements, what the law provides, and basically kind of really dig down in to everything that as an employer you need to know when navigating these laws. So, Rosemary, can you tell us just generally what this COVID-19 paid sick leave law is about? What additional protections does it provide for employees?
Yeah, well, so since we're going to dig down into it, I'll just give everybody just a high level. It's additional leave. It's additional paid leave for employees relative to a whole series of different things that can occur related to COVID-19. So, and it's above and beyond paid family leave. It is above and beyond your New York State paid sick and safe leave and FMLA, all of them. So this is a whole new set of leave requirements.
So, Ro, what additional protections generally does this new law provide for employees?
Well, so in terms of protections, Ari, it gives them job protected leave, just like any other leave, FMLA or paid family leave in New York State or the paid sick and safe leave. So it gives them job protection. It also gives them, if they can't work from home remotely, it gives them paid leave.
Right. So basically, Ro, this law, this newer law anyway, applies to employees who are looking to take leave because they've been ordered to quarantine or isolate due to having COVID-19 or being exposed to COVID-19, right?
That's exactly right.
Right. Ro, can you tell us a little bit about eligibility issues, specifically, what employees are covered by this new law? Part-time, full-time, or, what employees are eligible for this leave?
Well, again, you sit here, Ari, and you think, all right, well, so I know what's required under FMLA. I know what's required under paid family leave. You're right. There's all these requirements. And here, none of those exist. It's part-time employee, full-time employee, doesn't matter. any and all employees are entitled to this COVID, sick pay.
Right. That makes sense, Ro. And in that way, it's really a lot broader than the other sick leave laws that we've really encountered either at the New York State or federal level.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, and and they did it here in New York because you gave the dates at the start of this episode, but they did it because Federal Families First Coronavirus Response Act. So, Ari, from here on, let's just call it FFCRA. It's too much
Sounds
of a
good.
mouthful. So, yeah. So as I was saying, the whole reason the New York State COVID pay was enacted was because FFCRA had not yet come out, and so we had all of these people who were sick and couldn't work or were subject to quarantines, and so New York State said, "Hey, we need to do something. We need to have some sort of protections in place," and so that's why it was enacted. And then once FFCRA came out, then New York kind of fell to the wayside, right? Because FFCRA, as you know, was more broad, right? And
Right.
had similar rights, similar obligations and that, but it was, the eligibility reasons were broader. And now that FFCRA has expired, and it's important for everybody listening to know, FFCRA expired September 30th.
Right.
So I can't tell you how many people call us, Ari, and they say, well, how do I get the tax credit? I just had somebody go out, and it's like, no, it doesn't exist anymore. So it's all New York all the time right now.
Yeah, you anticipated my question, Ro, because I was going to just ask for clarification for our listeners. Just to clarify, the FFCRA is now expired. So we're really focused for our New York employers, on New York COVID-19 leave law protections.
Right. Exactly. It's really important that everybody realizes that.
Right.
Yeah. And then of course, Ari, I know we're going to talk about it, but your initial question was, who does this apply to? It applies to all the employees and the employers in New York State. So we know that, but I know we're going to talk about, the eligibility. So when are you entitled to this leave?
Right, exactly. Which leads me to my next question, Ro, which is, so in order to qualify for this leave, what must an employee do or be under? Just to clarify, I know we talked briefly before, but you have to be, as an employee, under an order of quarantine or isolation, correct?
That is correct. And it has to be from a state or local health agency or similar government entity. So to your doctor and having him or her write a note saying, Ari should stay home from work, or you go to WellNow and they say, we suggest this person stay home from work. That does not qualify under the law. It's actually got to be issued from, as I said, from a state or local agency.
Right. And a lot of times, or at least in my experience, I think for our clients, that local agency has usually been like the county department of health.
Correct. That's exactly right. Yeah.
So Ro, let me ask you this. I'm an employer. An employee calls me and says, I'm under an order of quarantine. I have COVID-19, or I've been exposed to someone who has COVID-19. As the employer, am I within my rights, or is it permissible under the law for me to say, okay, employee A, that's fine. You need to send me the order of quarantine or isolation from the Department of Health?
Absolutely, Ari. And, so you might have somebody, our listeners might be thinking, well, wait, isn't that, a HIPAA violation?
Yeah, that's a question we get a lot, I feel like.
Yeah, exactly. And the answer is no. Actually, the Department of Health and Human Services has come out. They produced a guidance in September and actually laid out specifically that when you're asking questions like this, so produce the quarantine order or produce proof of your vaccination status, those are permissible in an employer's role as the employer protecting the health and safety of their entire workforce. So yes, it is a medical record and it will be stored properly, confidentially, but it's not a violation of HIPAA to ask for the information, because
Right.
the only covered entities, as you know, Ari, under the HIPAA privacy rule, are your health plans, your health care providers, your health clearinghouses. So, and even
Exactly.
those covered entities, in their role as an employer, can ask for that information.
Yes. And I think that's
Yeah.
a really important point to make, Ro, because I think with, the pandemic and employer employee issues coming up, I think there's a lot of misconception about the applicability of HIPAA. And, that's something that I think our clients hear a lot from employees. Well, I don't want to give you X, Y, or Z because that's a violation of HIPAA. So I think that, a lot of our clients and our listeners know that, but I think that's such an important distinction because I think that's an issue that really comes up a lot.
Yeah, it really, and absolutely, they immediately, will scream HIPAA, 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 and I get it. I get it.
Right.
They're looking and they're saying this is information about me.
Right.
But as we said, the Department of Health and Human Services has come out specifically and said doesn't apply to employers.
Right. Right. I think that's really important. So, Ro, let me ask you another question. So, what if, as an employer, I get a call from an employee who says, I'm not feeling well, and, I have a fear of contracting COVID-19 in the workplace, or I have a fear that I might give COVID-19 to somebody in the workplace. Under this newish, I'll call it newish now because I can't believe we're already November 2021 and this has been in place since March 2020. But under this new law, can an employer, or must an employer, grant that person leave in those circumstances?
No, and this is exactly, Ari, as you know, when FFCRA comes in,
Yes.
right? Because a lot of this, somebody says, "Oh, I'm not feeling well. I'm seeking a diagnosis." Well, now they're eligible under, or they were eligible under FFCRA.
Right.
With New York State, none of that applies. So if you're seeking a diagnosis, if you have a fear, if you said, "Oh, I was exposed," none of those are valid reasons for someone to be eligible for this leave.
Right.
As you said, a few minutes ago, Ari, they must produce a quarantine order or order of isolation, and as we discussed, from a state or local agency, typically a local Department of Health, or the paid leave.
So, Ro, can you tell us a little bit more specifically about those employer requirements?
Sure. There's basically, I'd say, three buckets. All right. So the first is for employers who have 10 or fewer employees and less than $1 million in annual revenue, they just provide 5 days of unpaid leave. So it's unpaid leave. It's job protected. Everything else exists, but it's unpaid. The second bucket would be your employers who have 11 to 99 employees, and employers who have 10 or fewer employees, but revenues in excess of $1 million. And that bucket provides 5 days of paid leave. So the first one's unpaid, the second one is paid. Both are 5. And then for your larger employers, so 100 or more, they provide 14 days of paid leave. And actually, Ari, we should probably be more specific for our listeners and say up to 5 paid days and up to 14.
Right.
And I know we're going to talk about that more, but I want to make sure we're making that point. It's up to.
Yeah, I think that's an important clarification, Ro, because this law does not mean that because you are subject to this quarantine or isolation order, you're automatically entitled to 5 days. It's up to 5 days, or what you need as the employee. So I do think that's a really important distinction, and I'm glad you made it. And one other point is that everything that you just described applies to private employers.
Yes, that is correct. That is correct. And, not sure, Ari, I think we're going to talk about this, but maybe I'll jump ahead a little
Sure.
bit if you
Yeah,
don't
of
mind.
course.
So when we're talking about the up to, the way we like to explain it is somebody comes in or they don't come in because they're subject to a quarantine order, but you receive the quarantine order and you look and you see the individual is quarantined for, let's say, 10 days. All right, so they've got they're out from, December 1st to, let's say, December 11th. So they've got 10 days that they can't be in the workplace. And they can't work remotely. Because remember, that was our whole
Yes.
conversation, right? You can work remotely, you work
Right.
remotely. But so we have somebody that's subject to a 10-day quarantine order. They can't work remotely. And let's say you happen to be an employer that has got the 11, you fall in that bucket of 11 to 99. So you've got to provide 5 days, up to 5 days. So what you do is you look at the quarantine order, the start date and the end date, and you look and you see how many days would this individual have worked during that quarantine period, but for the quarantine order. And so let's say it was a part-time employee, Ari, and they only work 3 days a week
Right.
or 2 days a
Yep.
week. And so you look at the quarantine order, and in that 10-day spread, they only would have worked 2 days, because let's say it falls in a part where there's weekends in that. They only get the 2 days. This isn't, we're just going to write you a check for 5 days, right? So it's how many days would they have worked in that quarantine period, up to 5 or up to 14.
Yeah, I think that's
Okay.
again, I think that's really important for our listeners to know and appreciate, because I think with the passage of the law, there has been a little bit of misconception as it relates to this automatic right to certain leave, and it really is, that's really not what it is. It's very case specific and case dependent, as we know, because we get very
Yeah.
specific inquiries. So it's definitely a good distinction to make and a good thing to point out. One thing I wanted to review with you, Ro, is I think a question that I've gotten a couple times. I'm sure you've gotten a few times, and it relates to the interaction between this leave under this law and the existing New York paid sick and safe leave law, which is, can an employer require that an employee who's under a COVID-19 quarantine order use their existing accrued paid sick leave first?
Yeah, and great question. Everybody wants to do it, and the answer is
Right.
no, you cannot. Remember, we started off, Ari, you had me make the point that this is additional.
Right.
It's on top of. If somebody's subject to one of these quarantine orders, then they get the paid leave under that. We cannot force them to use their any accrued time. So whether it's sick or PTO or vacation.
And I think we both have probably had that. That's a common question, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and the other common question, Ari, is, okay, I understand the purpose of this and what my obligations are as the employer, but this person, let's say, is unvaccinated. Okay, so they're unvaccinated, and so why do I have to pay them? Vaccination status is irrelevant. If someone's subject to one of these orders, or they've tested positive, and then obviously they've got a quarantine order because of that, they are eligible for this leave.
It's a really good point, Ro. And just for our listeners, we won't get too much into it, but mandatory vaccination policies and vaccine issues, we will be discussing those as part of this COVID-19 related segment of podcast. So stay tuned, everyone, on that. Okay, Ro, what about if an employee voluntarily travels for pleasure and has to quarantine or isolate as a result of that travel?
Well, that's an interesting question, because we get this a lot. It's coming up a lot. So right now, and everybody, all of our listeners should know, this can change at any time. Everything's changing,
Right.
by the day, by the week.
Very true.
But currently, the way it stands is, if an employee travels to a CDC level 2 or level 3 country, or they travel to a state that is not contiguous. In other words, shares a border with New York State, for more than 24 hours, and it is for personal, so it's pleasure, it's vacation or something. They end up, contracting COVID, or they're subject to a quarantine order because they were exposed while they were traveling. They are not eligible. They're not eligible for this paid leave. Now, could they take their sick leave that they may have earned under their sick and safe leave law? Absolutely, because they're out sick. And in fact, I would probably make them use that sick time.
Right.
But this additional time, no, if they fall in that criteria. Now, if they travel on business to a level 2 or 3 CDC country or a non-contiguous state, state to New York, and they contract COVID or they're subject to a quarantine order when they return to New York, because they did that in the course of business, they are then eligible for the
But I think you mentioned this, Ro, in the beginning. But one of the things I did want to point out again is an employee who takes this leave, they are entitled pretty much absolute job protection during that period, right?
That's correct. Yep, that's correct. Yep.
That makes sense. So I think, Ro, what maybe we can transition to. I think we've, let me know if you want to add anything. I think we pretty much talked pretty exhaustively about the eligibility requirements and basically, the protections that this law affords. But I kind of wanted to transition and talk with you a little bit about how this law interacts with paid family leave. Ro, one common question I think we get from employers is what is the response from an employer if an employee requests leave under this law because the employee's child is under a mandatory order of quarantine or isolation?
Yeah, and that, as you know, Ari, that came up a lot for us when FFCRA was still in effect, because
Right,
that was one of the qualifying reasons,
right,
right? And that was why they expanded FMLA and so forth. But with New York State, doesn't apply, right? So the New York State COVID paid sick is specific to quarantine orders for the employee themselves. But of course, then the employer says, well, what's going to happen to this employee then? I mean, and they've got to stay home with their child who is subject to a quarantine order. And the answer is that the New York State paid family leave was amended when the pandemic hit, to include one of the reasons to expand the reasons for which you could qualify for New York State paid family leave. And it is now if your child is subject to a quarantine order or isolation order. And so so just as they apply for paid family leave for all the other reasons, it's the same thing here. So the employer would give the employee the paperwork, they'd complete it, and then the carrier would process it as they always do.
What if an employee has to stay home to care for a family member who has contracted COVID-19?
Yep, that's another reason. So, right, so paid family leave is all about you taking time to care for someone, right? And so again, they would just apply for it just like they normally would. So the pandemic doesn't make it any different.
So, Ro, what if you need more time?
So if an employee, so they've got their quarantine period or their quarantine order, and at the end of it, they need more time. They can't come back to work, Ari. And this happens. And so, again, paid family leave under New York State was amended when the pandemic hit to include if someone needs additional time off
Right.
beyond the 5 days or the 14 days. The other option, of course, is always short-term disability, depending on how long the individual is going to be out. But typically, what we're seeing is paid family leave being used because a child is subject to a quarantine order. And Ari, we should probably be real specific with our listeners that it's a quarantine order, again, issued by a state or local agency, right? So the Department of
Yeah,
Health or something. This isn't that the school sends the child home, because quite frankly, that's happening a lot,
it is.
right?
Yes. Right.
And so every time you turn around, you'd have individuals having to be out and apply for paid family leave, and probably a lot of employees rather, they don't want to burn through all that paid family leave, because heaven forbid something happened down the line when they need it for a serious medical condition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, just to clarify a point we made earlier, as it relates to a child being under an order of quarantine or isolation, we want to reiterate that, an employer is within their rights to request a copy of that order.
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. In fact, I would encourage them to do so, because it's a protection for the employer, but it's also for the employee. Yeah.
Agreed. So, Ro, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but again, I kind of do.
Yeah.
Can you think of maybe an interesting or the most, crazy question that you've been posited from a client as it relates to the interaction of this law with, sick leave or the paid family leave, or, something you thought was really interesting that you think would be beneficial for our listeners to hear about?
Um, so, I mean,
You
we
probably
hear it
could write a
all.
book, Ro.
That's right. I could. That's what I should have said. I could write a book. That's exactly right. So I think that one of the things that we're running into a lot now, which is interesting, is people with multiple exposures. Right. And
Right.
so they're exposed, they're subject to the quarantine order, a few weeks pass. And when this happens a lot, Ari, was in the summer months
Yes.
on those days when
Yes.
it looked good to be out on the lake in your boat.
Right.
So funny how that happens.
Not
But
today.
anyway, yeah, but seriously, so you've got people that have been exposed multiple times, and they're asking for their New York State COVID pay, and the answer is actually you're only eligible for one. So if someone is subject to a quarantine order because of a possible exposure, we know that's either up to, it's unpaid 5 days, up to 5 paid, or up to 14 paid. But so that's, you get one shot at that. But then what happens is if they get exposed again, then their question is, well, now what? I've got to be home for X number of days.
Yes.
And so that's where it then comes into, all right, so you could say to them, you know what, you should apply for paid family leave, see if you'll be approved for that.
Right.
And we're seeing a lot of them get approved, but sometimes not, because we've had somebody's had multiple exposures. And then I had talked about this before, Ari, and so we know it's one time for a quarantine order, but
Yes.
a person can actually or rather receive that COVID pay a second time and even a third time. But that's if and only if they unfortunately end up with a positive test.
Right.
So they test positive for COVID. So you can actually receive this COVID sick pay up to 3 times. Once for just a quarantine order, typically due to exposure, as I said, and then a second and third time if you test positive. Right. And then after that, so we did have one employee who unfortunately was exposed and then tested positive a second time, and still needed more time.
Oh,
It was like one of those long haulers. Very
Right.
sad story.
Yeah, that's very
So they then
unfortunate.
applied, for paid family leave. So they're kind of getting all of it.
That's a really good point, Ro. What another topic that I wanted to talk about with you today is New York's COVID-19 vaccination leave law, which, those of us who are in the field, it's labor law 196-C, a newer law. And, I wanted to transition to that topic. That was more recently signed into law, and this provision is actually effective until December 31st, 2022, barring any legislative extension. So can you tell us a little bit about this vaccination leave law, just generally, and what it's meant to provide leave for?
Sure. And actually, it's interesting, Ari, you just mentioned the expiration date of the vaccine leave law. We should probably tell our listeners that the New York State COVID sick pay does not have an expiration date. Yeah. So,
Right.
yeah. So no expiration. Just like we know FFCRA expired September 30th, there's no expiration on this. And as Ari said, the vaccine leave law expires December 31st of 2022. So what the vaccine leave does, it's meant to encourage employees to go out and get the vaccination. And it's
Right.
hard right now. Like people want to go and get the vaccination, but they might have to wait 2, 3, 4 days, or they might only be able to get in during their scheduled work hours. And we don't want anyone to be prevented from getting this vaccine. Have to make the decision between the vaccine or getting paid so I can put food on my family's table.
Exactly.
And so we wanted to, so New York State said, we want to make sure our people, don't have to choose between these two. So what the vaccine leave does is it permits employees to go during their regularly scheduled work hours, and they will be paid up to 4 hours of their regular rate of pay to go and get the vaccine. And so what's important to know is if somebody goes and gets the vaccine outside of their normal work hours, they're not entitled to the vaccine pay. Right.
That was going to be my next question. So just to clarify, there's no retroactive application.
Right.
If you need to, or you are going to receive a vaccination during your normal working hours, this law is intended to provide you with up to, the important qualifier being
Yes.
up to
Yes.
4 hours of paid leave at your regular rate of pay. And that is for each injection, right, Ro?
Right. That's right, for each injection. And again, the purpose of this is, that we don't want people to have to choose between their health and safety and putting food on the table, right?
Right.
Or, that's really what this is. And as you said, it is not retroactive, and it is per injection. And it isn't just an automatic 4 hours. So if somebody can sign up for the vaccination at 4:00 in the afternoon, and let's say their shift ends at 5, it doesn't mean, oh, okay, well, I can leave at, a little before 4 and I'm going to get 4 hours. Or I can leave work at, 1 and then take the whole afternoon off. That's not the way it works. So, and it's permissible for an employer to say, when is it scheduled? Could you show me, proof of that you're going to get the vaccination? But it is per injection. And hot off the presses, Ari, the beginning of this month, so November, the Department of Labor came out and said the vaccine leave law now applies to boosters. So initially, you cited to the law, so Section 196, it says per vaccine injection.
Yep.
All right, and so it didn't differentiate between boosters and that, and it was geared at getting individuals fully vaccinated, which was the 1 dose under J&J or 2 under the others.
Yep.
But now, because people are getting boosters, and again they want to encourage people to get boosters and to support that, they've said it applies to that. So same thing, you go and get a booster up to 4 hours.
So, Ro, we talked a lot about the eligibility requirements for employees under the COVID-19 sick leave law. Similar question for this law. Does this vaccine leave law apply to all employees?
It sure does. Part-time, full-time, everybody, and all employers.
One final question I have for you, Ro, I think, don't hold me to it, is what about if an employee wants to take leave for vaccine side effects? Is that something that's covered under this vaccination leave law?
That's a great question, and the answer is no. So this is actually, the leave is for you to actually get the vaccine. However, in terms of giving somebody recovery time, you can, unlike everything else that we've talked about today, you can require them to use their sick time. So you are obligated to permit them to take sick time, just as you do under the New York State sick and safe leave. Somebody can call off and say, I'm taking my New York State sick. They wouldn't say all of that. It's too much of a mouthful, right? But I'm calling in sick. So they can call in sick because they've got side effects. And you as the employer are obviously required to permit them to take that and to use that time. But you don't have to just give it to them, unlike the 4 hours of pay to get the vaccine, and unlike the up to 5 days or up to 14 days that you just have to give them.
Exactly. I think that's a good point too, because I think that's been a pretty common question as well, especially with more employees and more people getting their booster shot. I think that's a question that's come up a lot.
Yeah, because quite a few people have got reactions.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
present company included.
Yes, there you go.
Well, Ro, I wanted to say thank you so much. Those were all the topics that I wanted to cover with you today. I hope it wasn't too painful, but I think we got through it and we had a good time. And Ro, anything you want to add? Last closing
No.
final words?
No. I think that's it. I'm trying to think if I could give you something else since I so shocked you with my bungee jump. Oh, I know. Here's what I'll end with.
Okay. I'm
I
interested.
have I have ridden on. I went to the Great Pyramids. So most people you can drive up. I actually visited the Great Pyramids by camel. So got on camel, went across the desert, 3 hours to get to the Great Pyramid. So that's what I'll end with.
I mean, honestly, we could probably just have a podcast about your world travels.
Yeah.
I'm sure
Yeah.
that's interesting content for sure. But
Yeah.
I just want to say thanks again, Ro. Thanks to our listeners. Stay tuned for our next podcast where we are going to talk about what's up with COVID-19 vaccination mandates. Kind of a confusing area right now. There's a lot going on, and we will definitely talk it all out on our next episode. See you then. The Labor Employment Podcast is available on barclaydamon.com, YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Like, follow, share, and continue to listen. Thanks. This material is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice or a legal opinion, and no attorney-client relationship has been established or implied. Thanks for listening.